Have you ever felt someone pull away from you so completely that it felt like they erased you from their mind overnight, and you couldn't stop wondering if they were even capable of missing you at all? That question haunts millions of people sitting alone right now, staring at a phone that refuses to light up, replaying conversations that once felt so full of life and now feel like ghosts. The silence after a breakup with an avoidant person is not like ordinary silence. It's heavy. It's disorienting. It makes you question your own worth because the person who once chose you now acts like your existence doesn't register in their emotional world. And here's what makes it even more painful. You know they're not a bad person. You felt the love. You saw the moments where they let their guard down and let you in. So what happened? Where did that person go? And more importantly, will they ever come back? Here's what almost no one understands about avoidant attachment, and it's going to change the way you see this entire experience. The avoidant doesn't walk away because they stopped caring. They walk away because caring became too overwhelming for a nervous system that was trained from childhood to equate closeness with danger. And right now, in this very moment, there is a war happening inside their mind that they don't even have the words to explain. On one side, there is a deep human need for connection that lives in every single one of us, including them. On the other side, there is a protective mechanism so deeply embedded in their subconscious that it overrides everything. The instinct to retreat, to shut down, to numb out, to create distance the moment emotional intimacy feels like it's swallowing them whole. That war doesn't end when the breakup happens. In fact, the breakup is just the beginning of a psychological process that unfolds in stages that most people completely misunderstand. And that's exactly why you need to stay with this until the very end. Because what you're about to discover is not guesswork, not hope, and not generic advice. There is a specific psychological timeline that the avoidant goes through after no contact begins. A pattern rooted in attachment theory and the way the human nervous system processes emotional separation. By the time this is over, you will know exactly what is happening inside their mind at each stage, why the silence feels the way it feels, and the precise window where their subconscious begins pulling them back towards you. Not because they chose it, not because they planned it, but because their attachment system activates in a way they cannot control. But before we get into any of that, you need to understand something about what you're feeling right now. Because your pain is not random, and it's not weakness. If you're the kind of person who feels this breakup deeply, who lies awake at night trying to make sense of how someone could go from warm to cold so fast, there's a reason for that. Your own attachment system is activated. Your brain is in a state of emotional alarm, scanning for safety, searching for signals, trying to reconnect with the person who represented emotional security. That's not you being desperate. That's your nervous system doing exactly what it was designed to do when a bond is threatened. And the reason it hurts so much more with an avoidant is because the withdrawal was abrupt and emotionally incomplete. There was no closure conversation, there was no gradual goodbye, there was presence. And then there was nothing. That kind of emotional cutoff creates a psychological loop where your mind keeps searching for answers because it never got the signal that the bond was truly over. Now imagine what's happening on the other side. The avoidant is not sitting in peace the way it appears from the outside. The silence they're giving you looks like indifference, but indifference is not the same as emotional peace. What they've actually done is activated a defense mechanism called deactivation. A process where the brain suppresses attachment-related emotions to protect against the perceived threat of closeness. It's an ancient survival strategy. It's the same mechanism a child uses when they learn that expressing need leads to rejection or punishment. They stop expressing. They stop feeling. They go numb. And that numbness is what you're experiencing as silence. But here's the truth that changes everything. And this is the thread you need to hold on to through every single part of what comes next. That numbness is not permanent. It cannot last. It is a temporary emotional shutdown, not a permanent state of being. And the reason it cannot last is because the human attachment system is one of the most powerful biological and emotional forces in the entire body. It does not simply turn off forever, it goes dormant. And dormancy has an expiration date. So the real question is not whether the avoidant will feel again. The real question is when, and what happens inside them the moment that suppression begins to crack. Because that moment, that exact shift, is where everything changes. And most people miss it entirely because they've already given up walked away, or reacted in a way that resets the entire process. What you're about to learn is the psychological map of that process, stage by stage, emotion by emotion, from the first day of silence to the exact window where the avoidance internal walls begin to collapse. And once you see this map, you will never again confuse their silence for indifference. You will never again lie awake wondering if you've been forgotten. You will understand exactly what is happening beneath the surface. And more importantly, you will understand why your own emotional experience during this waiting period is the most important part of this entire journey, even though it doesn't feel that way right now. The avoidant is not gone. They are buried under their own defenses. And something inside them is already beginning to stir, whether they know it or not. What if the person who walked away from you actually felt nothing in those first few weeks? Not because they're heartless, but because their brain literally shut down the part of them that could feel. That's not a metaphor. That's how the avoidant nervous system operates in the immediate aftermath of a breakup. And understanding this is one of the most important things you will ever learn about what's happening on the other side of that silence. Because when you understand what deactivation actually is, when you see it for what it truly is, everything about their behavior suddenly makes sense. The coldness, the silence, the way they seem to move on without a single visible crack in their composure. None of that is proof that they never loved you. All of it is proof that their emotional system has gone into a state of protective shutdown that is so deep, so automatic, and so complete that they themselves don't even recognize what's happening. In the first days and weeks after a breakup, the dismissive avoidant experiences something that looks almost like freedom. And in many ways, it feels like freedom to them. The pressure of emotional expectations, the weight of someone needing them, the constant proximity to vulnerability, all of it lifts. And what rushes in to fill that space is not grief, it's relief. Genuine physical, nervous system level relief. Their body relaxes, their mind clears, they feel lighter. They might throw themselves into work, hobbies, social outings, or even new distractions, not because they're trying to forget you, but because their system has temporarily released them from the emotional load that closeness demanded. To them, the breakup feels like removing a heavy backpack they didn't realize was weighing them down. And that feeling is real. It's not performed, it's not a mask. The dismissive avoidant in the early weeks is not secretly crying into their pillow at night. They are genuinely numb, and that numbness feels like peace to them. The fearful avoidant, however, lives in a different reality during this same window. Their experience is not clean relief. It's a chaotic emotional split. One part of them feels the same freedom the dismissive avoidant feels, the release from the pressure of intimacy, the return to emotional safety, the ability to breathe without someone being close enough to trigger their fear. But another part of them, the part that carries deep abandonment wounds, feels a quiet, gnawing guilt, a heaviness they can't quite name. They might replay moments from the relationship in fragments. They might feel a pull to check on you, to reach out, to make sure you're okay. But every time that pull arises, the protective system kicks in and overrides it with the same message. Closeness is dangerous. You need space. Don't go back. So they sit in a contradictory emotional state, relief and guilt coexisting inside the same body, pulling them in opposite directions, creating a kind of internal noise that they don't know how to process. And because fearful avoidants struggle to tolerate emotional complexity, they often suppress the guilt and amplify the relief, telling themselves that walking away was the right decision. Now here is where the neuroscience becomes essential. Deactivation is not a choice. It is not a strategy. It is an automatic response hardwired into the avoidance nervous system through years of learning that emotional dependence leads to pain. When a child repeatedly experiences the message that their needs are too much, that their emotions are inconvenient, that vulnerability results in rejection or emotional abandonment, their brain develops a specific adaptation. It learns to suppress the attachment system, the biological mechanism that drives human beings to seek closeness and emotional safety in order to survive. By the time that child becomes an adult, this suppression has become so automatic that it operates below conscious awareness. The avoidant doesn't decide to shut down. Their brain does it for them, the same way your hand pulls back from a hot surface before you even register the pain. This is why the avoidant silence in the early weeks feels so absolute. It's not that they're intentionally freezing you out, it's that the part of their brain responsible for feeling attachment-related emotions has been temporarily taken offline. They are functioning, working, socializing, going through daily life, but they are functioning without access to the emotional layer that connects them to the relationship. It's like a house where the lights in one entire wing have been switched off. From the outside, the house looks normal. People are moving around in the rooms that still have light, but there's an entire section of that house sitting in complete darkness. And the avoidant isn't even looking in that direction yet. But here's what makes this phase so fragile and so temporary. And this is the piece that matters more than anything else you've learned so far. The activation is an energy-intensive process. The brain cannot maintain emotional suppression indefinitely. It requires constant psychological energy to keep those walls standing. And the avoidance system is running a defense that was designed for short-term protection, not long-term survival. The same mechanism that helped them survive childhood emotional neglect was never meant to hold forever. It was built to hold long enough to get through the threat. And once the threat, in this case the emotional intensity of the relationship, is gone, the brain slowly begins to withdraw that defense. Not because the avoidant wants it to, because the nervous system cannot sustain that level of suppression without eventually starting to crack under its own weight. So the question that changes everything is not whether the avoidant feels nothing forever. We already know that's impossible. The real question, the one that determines everything about what happens next, is what breaks the deactivation. What is the specific trigger, the specific moment, the specific internal shift that causes those walls to start crumbling and the suppressed emotions to begin leaking back into the avoidant's conscious awareness? Because that moment is coming, and it's closer than you think. What happens inside a person's mind, the moment they realize the silence they created is no longer protecting them, but consuming them? That moment doesn't arrive with a dramatic event. It doesn't come during a confrontation or a crisis or some cinematic turning point. It comes quietly. It comes in the spaces the avoidant thought they controlled, the empty moments they once filled with distractions that suddenly stop working. And that's what makes this phase so psychologically fascinating and so devastating at the same time. Because the crack in the avoidant's emotional armor doesn't begin with something external. It begins with something internal, a slow, almost imperceptible shift in the quality of their inner experience that they cannot identify, cannot control, and cannot stop. Think about what happens when a person builds walls around something they don't want to feel. In the beginning, those walls feel solid. They feel necessary. They feel like protection. But walls built to contain emotion are not like walls built to contain physical objects. Emotion is not static. It doesn't sit still. It builds pressure. It presses against the boundaries that hold it. And over time, weeks, sometimes longer, that pressure begins to find the weakest points in the structure. The avoidant doesn't feel this pressure building because their conscious mind is not designed to monitor what their subconscious is suppressing. But their body knows. Their nervous system knows. And the crack always begins at the level of the body before the mind catches up. It usually starts with something small and seemingly insignificant. A Sunday evening when the apartment is quiet and there's nothing left to distract them. A song that plays unexpectedly in a store, one that was playing during a moment that mattered with you. A holiday that arrives and suddenly the day feels hollow in a way they weren't prepared for. A smell. A routine that used to include another person and now has a gap where that person used to be. These are not dramatic triggers. They are micro moments. Tiny fractures in the daily architecture the avoidant has constructed to keep themselves insulated from feeling. And in those micro moments, something rises from beneath the surface. Not a full emotion. Not yet. Just a sensation. An emptiness. A faint, uncomfortable awareness that something is missing. Something they cannot name because the part of their brain that would identify it as longing has been offline for weeks. For the dismissive avoidant, this sensation is deeply confusing. They are not accustomed to feeling emotional voids. Their entire psychological structure is built around avoiding exactly this kind of experience. So when the emptiness arrives, they do what they've always done. They try to fill it. More work. More activity. More socializing. More noise. But here's what's different now. The distractions don't work the way they used to. The noise doesn't drown out the silence the way it did in the first weeks. Something has shifted. The suppression system is still running, but it's losing power. It's like a battery that's been drained. The machine is still on, but the output is weaker. And the avoidant starts experiencing something they haven't felt in a long time. Restlessness. An inability to fully settle. A sense that something is wrong inside them that they can't locate and can't fix. That restlessness is the first conscious evidence that the deactivation is beginning to fail. For the fearful avoidant, the crack is more intense and more chaotic. They don't just feel emptiness, they feel the return of longing. And the longing terrifies them. Because fearful avoidants carry two competing wounds, the fear of being engulfed by closeness and the fear of being engulfed by closeness and the fear of being abandoned. When the suppression starts weakening, the abandonment wound activates first. They start thinking about you, not in a controlled, voluntary way, but in a way that feels invasive. Thoughts arrive uninvited. Memories surface without warning. The image of your face appears in their mind during moments they didn't choose. And each time that happens, they feel two things simultaneously. A pull toward you and a spike of fear that reaching out will lead to the same pain they were trying to escape. So they oscillate. They move toward the thought of you, then yank themselves back. They pick up their phone, then put it down. They open a message, then close it. This push-pull happens internally, in silence, with no visible evidence to the outside world that anything is happening at all. What's driving this entire process is something called attachment system reactivation. The attachment system, the biological and emotional mechanism that governs human bonding, never actually dies. It goes dormant during deactivation. But dormancy is not death. And as the suppressive defense weakens over time, the attachment system begins waking up, slowly, in waves, not all at once. It sends signals to the emotional centers of the brain, reactivating memories, feelings, and the deep human need for connection that the avoidant spent years learning to override. This is not a conscious decision. The avoidant is not sitting down one evening and deciding to miss you. Their subconscious is forcing emotional content back into their awareness in a way that bypasses their logical defenses entirely. And this is the truth that most people never understand about the avoidant's return. The avoidant does not come back because they chose to. They come back because their attachment system eventually overpowers their conscious resistance. The walls they built were never permanent. They were a temporary structure, and the human need for connection is not a temporary force. It is the most persistent, the most resilient, and the most powerful emotional drive in the human body. It can be suppressed, it can be delayed, but it cannot be eliminated. So the crack has begun. The suppression is weakening. The attachment system is reactivating. The avoidant is starting to feel things they can't control and can't explain. And now the only question that matters, the one that everything has been building toward, is when exactly does this process reach its breaking point? When does the crack become a collapse? Because there is a specific window, a specific range of time, where the avoidance defenses fall far enough that the pull to reach out becomes stronger than the fear of staying away. That timeline is not random. It follows a pattern. And that pattern is what comes next. How long does it really take for someone who shut you out to start feeling your absence so deeply that it overrides every defense they've ever built? That question has a real answer. Not a vague one. Not a comforting platitude. A psychological timeline that follows a recognizable pattern. One that attachment researchers and relationship psychologists have observed repeatedly across thousands of breakups involving avoidant partners. And once you see this timeline laid out in front of you, the entire experience of waiting becomes something entirely different. You stop guessing. You stop spiraling. You stop interpreting every hour of silence as evidence that you've been forgotten. Because what you're about to see is that the silence is not a flat line. It is a descending staircase, and the avoidant is walking down it step by step, moving closer and closer to a moment where the weight of their own emotional suppression becomes unsustainable. In the first 14 days after no contact begins, the avoidant is in what can be called the relief window. This is the peak of deactivation. The dismissive avoidant feels light, free, and emotionally unburdened. They are not thinking about the relationship in any meaningful emotional way. Their brain has successfully suppressed attachment content, and they are operating in a state that feels, to them, like clarity. The fearful avoidant is slightly more unsettled during this window, experiencing flashes of guilt or nostalgia, but those flashes are quickly overridden by the protective system. During these 2 weeks, Reaching out is the furthest thing from their mind. Their nervous system is still convinced that distance equals safety, and every day that passes without contact reinforces that belief. This is the phase that hurts the viewer the most, because it looks and feels like permanent erasure. But it is the shallowest layer of the process. It is the surface, and surfaces change. From roughly day 15 to day 30, the avoidant enters the distraction phase. The initial relief has begun to fade, not dramatically, but enough that the avoidant starts reaching for external stimulation more aggressively. They might go out more. They might start a new project. They might immerse themselves in social activity, or consume more content, more entertainment, more noise. What they're doing, unconsciously, is filling the space that the relationship occupied, because the relief that felt so clean in the first 2 weeks is starting to thin out. The distractions work, but they require more effort. The avoidant doesn't recognize this as emotional hunger because they've never been taught to identify that sensation. They just feel a low-grade restlessness, a sense that something is slightly off, and they respond by doing more, consuming more, moving faster. But the body keeps score, and underneath the noise, the attachment system is beginning its slow reactivation. The walls are still standing, but the pressure behind them is building. Between day 30 and day 60, the crack begins. This is where the internal shift becomes undeniable, at least to the avoidant subconscious. The distractions that worked in weeks 2 through 4 start losing their grip. The emptiness that was once faint becomes persistent. The dismissive avoidant starts noticing that their usual coping mechanisms aren't delivering the same satisfaction. They feel bored in ways they can't explain. They feel a strange sense of emotional flatness, like life has texture but no color. They may not connect this to the breakup. Their conscious mind is still interpreting the emptiness as something unrelated, but their subconscious knows exactly what it's longing for. During this window, the avoidant may begin passively monitoring, checking social media without engaging, asking mutual contacts casual questions, or finding reasons to be in spaces where they might encounter information about you. They are not ready to reach out, but they are no longer fully detached. The thread between you and them is being quietly rewoven from the inside. Then comes the critical window, roughly day 60 to day 90. This is where everything converges. The emotional suppression that held for weeks is now failing in ways the avoidant cannot ignore. The void is no longer background noise. It is foreground. It occupies space in their chest, their thoughts, their quiet moments. For the dismissive avoidant, this is the window where the pull to reconnect becomes stronger than the fear of intimacy, temporarily, powerfully, and often unpredictably. They may reach out with something small, a message that seems casual, a question that seems unnecessary, a reason to make contact that looks practical on the surface but is emotionally driven underneath. For the fearful avoidant, this window arrives sooner and more chaotically, sometimes between day 45 and day 70, because their attachment system reactivates faster due to the intensity of their abandonment wound. Their return is often emotionally charged, impulsive, and followed quickly by second-guessing. They reach out, then retreat. They express warmth, then go cold. They are caught between two fears, the fear of losing you and the fear of being close, and both fears are firing at full intensity. But here is something essential, something you must hold on to with everything you have. This timeline is a psychological pattern, not a guarantee. The depth of the relationship matters. The length of time you are together matters. The avoidant's personal history, their level of self-awareness, whether they've ever done any inner work. All of these variables shift the timeline forward or backward. A dismissive avoidant who has never confronted their attachment patterns may take longer. A fearful avoidant who has begun to recognize their triggers may cycle faster. The timeline is not a clock. It is a map of internal pressure, and pressure behaves differently depending on the terrain. What matters, what changes everything, is that you now understand the architecture of the process. The avoidance silence is not a wall that stands forever. It is a defense that degrades under the weight of its own energy cost. And somewhere between day 60 and day 90, sometimes earlier, sometimes later, that defense reaches a point where the emotional vacuum inside the avoidant becomes louder than the fear that drove them away. They come back not because they decided to. They come back because their nervous system demanded it. But why they come back, the real, hidden reason, is something almost no one talks about. And that reason is the next thing you need to hear. What if the reason they come back has nothing to do with you and everything to do with the hunger inside them that they can't feed anywhere else? That truth is uncomfortable. It's hard to sit with, but it's the most important psychological insight you will encounter in this entire journey because it separates the people who get trapped in the cycle from the people who break free from it. The avoidant does not come back because they've suddenly healed. They don't come back because they've spent weeks in deep reflection, reading about attachment theory, confronting their childhood wounds, and arriving at a place of emotional maturity. That version of events is the one everyone hopes for. It's the one that plays out in movies and in the stories people tell themselves late at night when they're trying to find meaning in the silence. But that is not what's happening. What's happening is far more primal, far more subconscious, and far more honest than any narrative of sudden transformation. The avoidant comes back because their attachment system has reactivated, and the emotional void that the reactivation has created is now louder than the fear of intimacy that drove them away. That's it. That's the mechanism. It's not romantic. It's not a sign of growth. It's a biological and emotional pressure system reaching a breaking point where the need to reconnect overrides the instinct to protect. And the thing they're reaching toward is not necessarily you as a person. It's the feeling you gave them. The feeling of being wanted. The feeling of being emotionally held. The feeling of mattering to someone. A feeling that their everyday life, with all its distractions and surface-level connections, cannot replicate. You represented something their nervous system recognized as emotionally essential. And once the suppression wore off, the absence of that feeling became unbearable. That distinction between missing the person and missing the feeling is painful but necessary, because it explains everything about why the avoidance return often feels confusing, half-hearted, or full of mixed signals. They reach out, but the energy is off. They send a message, but it feels cold. They want to talk, but they keep the conversation shallow. They say they miss you, but their behavior doesn't match their words. And that creates a disorienting experience for the person on the receiving end, because it looks like contact, but it doesn't feel like connection. The reason is that the avoidant is being pulled by two opposing forces at the same time. Their attachment system is pulling them toward you, screaming that something vital is missing. Their defensive system is pulling them away, warning that closeness means danger. And they are standing in the middle of that internal war, reaching out with one hand while pulling back with the other. This is what creates the push-pull dynamic that so many people experience when an avoidant returns. One day they're warm, engaged, responsive, even affectionate. The next day they're distant, short replies, slow responses, a sudden withdrawal that feels like it came from nowhere. And the person waiting for them interprets this as instability, manipulation, or even cruelty. But it's none of those things. It's the avoidance nervous system oscillating between two survival responses, the drive to connect and the drive to protect, neither of which they can fully control. They are not playing games. They are trapped in a psychological loop that operates beneath their conscious awareness, and every time they move toward closeness, their defense system fires a warning signal that pulls them back. The dismissive avoidance return tends to be subtle and controlled. They don't come back with grand declarations. They come back with small, measured gestures, a text about something mundane, a like on a post, a casual question that serves as a probe to test whether the emotional waters are safe. They are checking for threat. They are scanning for signs that reconnecting won't immediately demand the level of emotional vulnerability that triggered their withdrawal in the first place. If the response they receive is warm but not overwhelming, they may stay. If the response is emotionally intense, full of longing, expectations, or pressure, their defense system reactivates instantly and they vanish again, sometimes within hours, sometimes within minutes. The fearful avoidance return is more volatile. They come back with more emotional openness, sometimes intensely, sometimes desperately, because their abandonment wound is driving the reconnection. They might express real longing. They might seem genuinely different. They might cry, apologize, or say things that feel like breakthroughs. But the moment the connection starts to deepen, the moment it feels real and stable and close, their fear of engulfment activates, and they retreat just as hard as they reached out. This creates a cycle that is devastating for both people. The fearful avoidant is in pain. The person waiting for them is in pain. And the pain is being generated not by a lack of love, but by an attachment system that is simultaneously screaming for connection and terrorized by it. So here's what you need to understand about this moment. The moment the avoidant comes back, it is not the finish line. It is not the resolution. It is a psychological threshold. And what happens next determines whether the relationship enters a new phase or simply repeats the same cycle that ended it the first time. Because the avoidance return is driven by subconscious need, not by conscious change. They haven't done the work. They haven't healed the wound. They haven't learned to tolerate intimacy. They've simply reached a point where the hunger became louder than the fear. And that means the most dangerous moment in this entire process is not the silence. It's the return. Because when they come back, you're going to feel a rush of relief so powerful that it will override every boundary you've built, every insight you've gained, and every promise you made to yourself while you were waiting. And in that moment, the moment you open the door without hesitation, everything you're about to learn becomes the most important thing you'll ever understand about this dynamic. What happens to two people when one reaches out from hunger and the other opens the door from loneliness? The answer is one of the most painful patterns in all of relationship psychology, and it's the pattern that almost no one sees coming because it disguises itself as reunion, as healing, as the moment everything finally gets fixed. The avoidant comes back, the anxious partner receives them, and for a brief window, sometimes days, sometimes hours, it feels like the storm has passed. The silence is over. The waiting is over. The person who left is here again, and the relief of that arrival is so overwhelming that it floods the nervous system with a sense of safety that feels indistinguishable from real resolution. But it's not resolution. It's a chemical response. It's the attachment system getting what it was craving, proximity to the person it bonded with, and interpreting that proximity as evidence that the danger has passed, and that interpretation is the trap. Because the moment the avoidant senses that the door is open, truly open, emotionally open, no longer guarded, something shifts inside them almost immediately. The same reconnection that felt like relief to the anxious partner feels like threat to the avoidant. Not because they don't want to be there, not because their feelings were fake, but because the openness, the warmth, the emotional availability that greets them is exactly the thing their nervous system was built to perceive as danger. Closeness. Need, expectation, the unspoken pressure of being loved by someone who has been waiting. All of it registers in the avoidant's body as a signal. The same signal they received as children when their emotional needs were too much for the people around them. And that signal activates the same response it always has. Shutdown, withdrawal. The slow, quiet retreat that begins the moment closeness stops feeling like a choice and starts feeling like a demand. This is where the cycle reignites. The avoidant begins to pull back, subtly at first. Slower responses, shorter messages, a slight emotional flatness that wasn't there in the first hours of reconnection. And the anxious partner, hyper-attuned to every micro-shift because their nervous system has been on high alert for months, notices immediately the warmth that was there yesterday is gone today. The openness has been replaced by something cautious and distant, and the anxious partner responds the way their attachment system demands. They pursue. They ask questions. They seek reassurance. They try to close the gap that just opened. But every attempt to close the gap pushes the avoidant further away, because each bid for connection confirms the avoidant's deepest fear. That closeness means being consumed, being responsible for another person's emotional state, being trapped in a dynamic where their own needs will always be secondary. And so the avoidant deactivates again. Sometimes within days of the return, sometimes within hours. The walls go back up. The emotional suppression reactivates. The avoidant stops feeling, not by choice, but by the same automatic defense that drove the original breakup. And the anxious partner is left standing in the exact same place they were before, abandoned, confused, and wondering what they did wrong. The answer is nothing. They did nothing wrong. They responded to connection with connection. They opened their heart to someone they loved. The problem is not in their response. The problem is in the dynamic, a dynamic that repeats itself endlessly until one of two things happens. Either the avoidant does the internal work required to tolerate intimacy, or the anxious partner stops playing the role their attachment system has assigned them. That role is the role of the chaser. The one who waits. The one who holds the emotional space for both people. The one who absorbs the avoidance fear and tries to love it away. And the reason this dynamic is so persistent, the reason that traps people for months, years, sometimes entire lifetimes, is because both sides are responding to deeply embedded childhood patterns that feel like survival. The avoidant learned that needing someone leads to pain, so they flee. The anxious partner learned that love is conditional on closeness, so they pursue, and each time the cycle repeats, both patterns get reinforced. The avoidant's belief that closeness is dangerous gets confirmed. The anxious partner's belief that they must fight for love gets confirmed. And the relationship becomes a loop approach, withdraw, pursue, retreat that never reaches resolution because neither person is addressing the root. This is what psychologists call the anxious avoidant trap. And it is the most common attachment pairing in romantic relationships, not because the universe is cruel, but because anxious and avoidant people are magnetically drawn to each other. The anxious partner feels familiar to the avoidant because their neediness echoes the emotional environment the avoidant grew up in, an environment where they learned to suppress their own needs to manage someone else's. The avoidant feels familiar to the anxious partner because their distance echoes the emotional unavailability the anxious partner grew up with, an environment where love was something you had to earn by being close enough, good enough, patient enough. Both people are unconsciously recreating the emotional landscape of their childhood, hoping this time they'll get a different outcome. But the outcome is always the same, because the patterns haven't changed. No contact, when used with awareness, breaks this loop, not as a weapon, not as a strategy to make the avoidant miss you, but as the only condition under which both nervous systems can exit the cycle. For the avoidant, no contact removes the perceived threat of closeness, and without that threat, their deactivation serves no purpose, which allows the attachment system to reactivate naturally. For the anxious partner, no contact creates the space to regulate their own nervous system, to step out of the chaser role, to reconnect with their own emotional center, and to begin the process of asking a question they've never asked before. Not when will the avoidant come back, not how to make the avoidant come back, but something far more important, something that determines whether this cycle ends or repeats forever. That question is, what comes next? And the answer is, the one thing that changes everything. Not just about this relationship, but about every relationship that follows. What if the entire time you've been waiting for them to come back, something was quietly happening inside you that is bigger than anything they could ever offer you by returning? That question is the one that reframes this entire experience, not as a story about someone leaving, but as a story about someone arriving at themselves, arriving at a version of their own life that is no longer organized around another person's emotional availability. Because here is the truth that sits beneath every attachment pattern, every cycle of waiting, every night spent staring at a phone, and every moment of silence that felt like it was destroying you. No contact was never about the avoidant. It was never a strategy to pull someone back. It was never a waiting game designed to break their resistance. No contact is the first act of self-respect you've taken in a relationship dynamic that taught you to abandon yourself in order to keep someone else close. And that act, that decision to stop reaching, stop chasing, stop collapsing your boundaries to accommodate someone else's fear, is the moment your own healing begins. The avoidance attachment system needs space to reactivate. That is real. The psychological timeline is real. The crack in their defenses, the emotional void, the reactivation of longing, all of it is real. But what happens inside you during that same period is equally real, and it matters more. Because while the avoidant is going through their process of suppression, cracking, and eventual reactivation, your nervous system is going through its own transformation. In the early days of no contact, your attachment system is in full alarm mode. Your body is in withdrawal, the same neurochemical withdrawal that happens when any bond is severed. Your brain is scanning for safety, craving the proximity of the person who represented emotional security, interpreting their absence as a threat to your survival. That is not weakness. That is biology. But here's what changes as the weeks pass. Something begins to shift. Slowly, quietly, without announcement. Your nervous system starts regulating without them. Your body begins to settle into a new baseline, one where safety is no longer dependent on a text message, a response, a sign of life from someone who taught you that love is something you wait for. And that shift That internal recalibration is the most powerful thing that happens during no contact, because when your nervous system learns to regulate without the avoidance presence, you stop needing them the way you used to. Not in a bitter, defensive way. Not in a way that pretends you don't care. In a real way. A way that comes from your body actually experiencing its own stability, its own emotional sufficiency, its own capacity to feel safe without another person's approval. And that is when something extraordinary happens. You stop waiting, not because you gave up, not because you decided to move on as a strategy. You stop waiting because your body has caught up with your mind, because the part of you that was screaming for connection has finally found a source of connection that doesn't depend on someone else's willingness to stay. And here is where this entire journey reaches its deepest truth. The real revelation was never about the exact day the avoidant comes back. The real revelation is who you become in the days you spend without them. Because the person who enters no contact is not the same person who comes out of it. The person who enters is anxious, ungrounded, emotionally dependent, living in a state of constant alert, checking, analyzing, interpreting, suffering. The person who emerges is someone whose nervous system has learned to self-regulate, someone who has sat with their own pain without escaping it, someone who has confronted the deepest, oldest wound they carry, the wound that says love means abandonment, that closeness means loss, that your needs will always be too much for the people around you, and has begun to heal it, not through another person's return, but through their own presence with themselves. That is the transformation no one talks about. That is the shift that changes not just this relationship, but every relationship that follows. Because when you heal the pattern, when you stop recreating the childhood dynamic of chasing emotionally unavailable people, you stop being available for the cycle. You stop being the person who holds the space for someone else's fear while abandoning your own needs. You become someone whose emotional center is rooted in themselves, not in the unpredictable rhythms of an avoidant partner's internal war. And from that place, that grounded, self-sufficient, emotionally sovereign place, you make a choice. Not from hunger, not from fear, not from the desperate hope that this time will be different. From clarity. If the avoidant comes back and you've done this work, you will see them differently. You will see the return for what it is, not a grand romantic gesture, not a sign that they've transformed, but a subconscious pull from someone who is still operating inside the same patterns that drove them away. And from that clarity, you get to decide. You get to decide whether to engage, whether to set boundaries, whether to walk away, not from a place of wound, but from a place of strength. And if they don't come back, you will already be whole. Not because they were never important, not because the love wasn't real, but because you discovered something that no breakup, no silence, no withdrawal can ever take from you, the capacity to be your own emotional home. So the question that started this journey, the one about the exact day the avoidant comes back, has a final answer that no one expected. The exact day was never about them. It was about you. The day you stop waiting is the day you come back to yourself. And that return, that quiet, powerful, irreversible return, is the one that changes everything.